what I want to be. But I never seem to catch up. No matter how I try, doesn't matter I wanna be. I'm always just one step behind. Now it feels like something is about to change. I can feel it coming. Yeah. This is our day. This is our day. This is our day.
Okay, Aggies, howdy. Welcome back to Exercise Biomechanics. This indeed is the day for our fourth installment of Exercise Biomechanics. So today is going to be all about the mechanical analysis of movement, how to do it, the different types, how it relates to areas of measurement. So measurement's going to be key. You guys are going to be making measurements or using measurements in the laboratory section. It's all about doing science, and science is about measuring things and testing hypotheses and seeing if they're on the right track. So we're going to go over some reference terminology. So last time we were talking about the anatomical reference system, and this time it's the linear and angular reference systems. So keep those in mind. All human movement occurs through rotation around joints and body segments. So that means angular movement, rotation. The ability to produce torque is probably the most important thing we'll cover, except for all of the material related to tendons, ligaments, bones, cartilage, and muscles, where we start getting into more of the applied aspect of the class. Now, having said that, because biomechanics is an applied science, everything here that we're going to be doing is applied. It's not a basic science. It's not chemistry. It's not physics. It's what you do with it. And so when we're looking at and using equations, is what we can do with it. When we talk about the anatomies, what can we do with it? How can we do analysis? How can we determine whether or not either a rehabilitation program or maybe some new techniques that we're using in a particular sport, whether it's tennis or volleyball, are actually working. So it's all about making measurements and testing. So without further ado, we're going to get into the linear and angular mechanical analysis and those movements. So again, with any type of reference system, you have an origin. So remember the anatomical reference system, the origins, that's going to look weird. Okay, was the anatomical position. And for the linear coordinate system or the Cartesian coordinate system, it's where the X and Y axes cross, for example. That's going to be where our origin occurs. So that's our zero or reference point. And we also have a reference point with the angular reference system as well. So we'll talk about that. And we'll go over some really basic geometry. And I'll have a short section. It'll probably be next on trigonometry. It'll be really, really short. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I want to actually use it rather than cover it. It's material you've had probably back in your 4x4 high school set of classes back in the day. So if not, covering it in college. Okay, so all human movement, whether we're doing a knee extension exercise and rehabbing a knee, or hitting a tennis ball, old school tennis serve here because we got a wooden racket, but we're going to look through a series of pictures, series of images. So movements occur in time and space. So that means we follow a tennis ball or follow the movement of a tennis racket or a golf club, or maybe someone's arm when they're spiking a volleyball, or maybe their leg when they're kicking a soccer ball. So we're going to analyze both linear and angular movement, show you how to do that. So in the linear reference system, we're following a line. Now, it could be a straight line. We call that a rectilinear movement, like running the 100-meter dash outside. Or it could be curvilinear movement, following the path of a ball, or maybe a golf club as it's going through its flight. It's going to follow a curved path. It's still linear in a sense if we follow the line. We can also follow the angle or arc, so that will be we'll use our angular reference system then. So linear can be in a straight line. We can use Cartesian coordinates to solve for that. When it's curvilinear, there are a number of equations that we can use. If we're following the path of a ball, we can assume it's a parabola. And so there's some equations involved that will help to describe that. So this is one of the advantages of working with applied physics, is that we can predict what's going to happen by using a lot of simple equations. There's some things like looking at the turbulence in maybe a creek that's where the water is going around a rock, or maybe vortices and the tornado that's forming. That math is incredibly complicated. But a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about and follow for the most part is not complicated. When it gets a little complicated, when we talk about a curveball, we're going to look at some specific principles that we can rely on that will help to describe and predict what's going on. So let me give you a perfect example of how Newton's laws and how these equations are so predictable. They are reliable. We're going to get the same thing again and again if we make a certain measurement under certain conditions. So for example, we know when there's going to be a total eclipse of the sun in 2024. It's going to go right around Austin, I think just west of Waco and around Killeen. So our goal is to actually travel up to the Killeen area, because that's going to have some of the longest totality, and there's actually the greatest chance that there won't be a lot of clouds compared with south of that and compared with north of Killeen. So we'll see. We'll have, depending upon the weather on that date, I think it's April like 8th or something like that, or 10th. On that date in April, we'll have contingencies for sure. So we could be following somebody running in a straight line. So here's a 100-meter, 200-meter runner, English Gardner, who's won, I think, the NCAA a couple of times, and I think was set to participate in the Olympics, but that's now been delayed a year to 2021, and we'll see who we have at that time. We could be just someone maybe has had a car accident or a spinal injury, and they're just trying to walk in a straight line again. So rectilinear means following a straight line path. Curvilinear follows a curved path. We could follow, this is Serena Williams way back in the day in the US Open, still after, this is 20 years ago, still after 20 years, she's still pretty close to the top. Here she is hitting a forehand shot. We could follow that curved path of the racket around the wrist and around the shoulder. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to be using is predictable. We can use equations to be able to solve for them. A lot of the basic equations, I'm going to have you remember so that you can use them. Anything that you know, you'll be able to use a little bit better. And one of the things we're going to do is start with the most basic variables first, like distance, and then move to velocity, acceleration, force, torque, etc. As we're moving along those variables and building up towards more complex variables and concepts, we're going to be doing both linear and angular analysis. So when we look at linear distance, we're going to also talk about arc or angular distance or movement. So something that's curvilinear can move in a curved path. So in a 400-meter track, you have basically two turns. They're really two semicircles, and then you have two straightaways. If you're following the path of a football, it follows a curvilinear path. Basically a parabola. There's some effective wind drag, and we'll talk about all kinds of cool things, including how a spiral reduces the effect of wind drag and makes it more stable in the air. Here are a couple of famous quarterbacks. Tom Brady, I'm going to have to change in the upcoming season his uniform. Now he's going to, I think, Tampa Bay. There's Ryan Tannehill, who's changed teams a couple of times. It's actually my daughter's favorite Aggie football player. I think he's with Tennessee right now, was with the Dolphins for a long, long time. When we're analyzing either distance or movement in Cartesian or orthogonal coordinates, meaning for the most part, we're either estimating something's moving in a straight line or we're using high-speed video so we can just approximate it. These coordinates can give us information on the X, Y, and Z axes. They can be used for linear measurements. Generally, I probably should turn this puppy sideways. In fact, let me see if I can do that here. Yes, I can. That's kind of cool. Okay, that's not great. Yeah, because I noticed the Z axis. So this was from actually some engineering stuff. Engineers are a little peculiar in that they often think of the Z-axis as the vertical axis. And that's because when you're thinking about either developing or measuring or using something like a force or pressure plate, they think about the machine as a person. So the person is going to have, for example, a Z-axis coming from the frontal plane. For an engineer, they've got the Z-axis moving upwards. So let's reorient ourselves literally here and move on to the next frame. There we go. I'm going to have to edit this. So here's our y-axis. This is what we're going to use. We're going to use the y-axis as a vertical axis. We have two horizontal axes. Our x-axis is perpendicular with the sagittal plane. It's going to go from left to right. The y-axis is going to go from top to bottom, perpendicular with the transverse plane. The z-axis is perpendicular with the frontal plane. And it basically is where rotation occurs for frontal plane movements. That's going to go from front to back. So let's look at some one-dimensional analysis, then a little bit about two-dimensional analysis, and then three-dimensional analysis. I was looking at the form of two really famous Olympic gold medal winners for the United States. Jesse Owens, 1936, proved there is no master race. In fact, one of the things that genetics has taught us in the last 20 years, that from a genetic standpoint, race doesn't exist in humans. There's just one race. That's the human race. So we're all related. As they say, we're all in it together. There are certainly a lot of differences in terms of culture and society and religion, etc. And we're socioeconomic groups, etc. But in terms of genetics, there isn't that much diversity, believe it or not, in the human genome. This is important because it helps us to be able, I think, to communicate with each other globally, because we always have more in common than we don't. And I think recent events have probably shown that people are starting to come into agreement about some things regarding, race and how we treat others. We should treat others by the golden rule, and that golden rule should apply to everyone. So getting back to Jesse Owens, 1936, one of the things to notice is that look at his mechanics, look at his posture, so much different than the other runners. This was actually a big change, a sea change, if you will. So the other runners that you see, they learned to run leaning over from the fact that the types of tracks that they had way back in 1910, 1920 something were made of cinder. And that's basically like a black pumice or dirt. And in fact, they didn't have starting blocks. They actually you were given a trowel and you dug into the cinder track. You got your feet settled, and then you took off when the gun sounded. So when you're running on something like sand or dirt, you probably notice this. You probably need to lean forward, because as you're pushing off, the sand and the dirt and the cinder track is giving a little bit. So that's why they lean forward, because they were taught by their coaches how to run on a cinder track. But this is more of a composite track, something similar to what we might have today. I think it's probably made of an asphalt-like material. And here we see a track today, which is kind of a rubberized asphalt, if you will. This is Michael Johnson. This is the 1996 Olympic Games. So it's a little earlier. The scary thing, this is probably before virtually all of you guys were born now. I'm like freaking out. Wow. So 1996 Olympic Games. This is a gold medal winner in the 200-meter race as well as the 400-meter race. So one of the things to notice is that their posture is pretty similar. It's that upright posture that actually allows them to be able to push off better, especially look at this hyperextension here, and to be able to generate a little bit more torque and be able to hit the ground a little bit faster. So the more torque you can produce and the faster the turnover of the legs. If you want to call it RPMs, that's fine. Another way to think about it is we call it stride rate. So the faster the stride rate and the greater the torque, the faster a sprinter goes. It works kind of the same way as a drag car. So drag racing, the more torque the engine can produce and the faster those wheels spin, the faster the vehicle's going to go. So it's kind of the same thing. So the fastest human can go about 27 and a half miles an hour. That's pretty fast. Not too many of us can do that. In fact, it's actually relatively unusual. Most humans are pretty good at running about 10 to 15 miles an hour and maintaining that speed, especially our ancestors when they're in pretty good shape. That allowed them to be able to chase down prey. Again, because we have very tiny hairs and we've got a lot of surface area and we can sweat and we're kind of ideal for dissipating heat, which is a good thing in Texas, right? Because summer is starting. Well, now we've had a couple of really nice days, but heat's building. It's going to get worse and worse before it gets better. So in 2 dimensions, here we have our X and our Y axis. One of the things to keep in mind is that the X and Y axis and the X, Y, and Z axis are all perpendicular with each other, meaning they're all at a right angle or a 90-degree angle. So that means that when we can do this analysis, we can use some right triangle trigonometry. When we have a set of coordinates and it's 2 dimensions, the first coordinate is the X coordinate, the second one is the Y coordinate. So this is +5 in the X direction, +3 in the Y direction. When there's a movement, when we're looking at a difference in position of an arm or a ball over time, we're going to look at the change in those coordinates, draw a straight line if we're doing linear analysis, and then use the Pythagorean theorem. So we'll review the Pythagorean theorem pretty soon. Excuse me. When we have 3 axes, X, Y, and Z axes, again, they're at right angles with each other. Now, the Z axis right now doesn't really look like it's at a right angle, but it's coming towards you guys. So if we have a position of, let's say a ball's at +4, let's give it some units, meters, and the X direction +2 meters in the Y direction and +5 meters in the Z direction, we would go across 4, up 2, and then out 5. So that ball is actually in front of this 2-dimensional image that you're looking at. And again, a reminder that the X, Y, and Z axes are all perpendicular with each other. So I'm going to put in my units while I'm here, right? There we go. Fix that a little bit. There we go. Okay, so those are some really some really basic information about the linear reference system. So now let's look at the angular reference system, where we spend a little bit more time. We're going to practice a little bit, do a couple little problems, because most people aren't as familiar with them. And when there are mistakes made, they usually aren't made with the orthogonal coordinate system. It's usually this angular reference system. And the key is the origin. If you know where the origin is, everything else gets a lot easier. So let me explain. So remember, with the Cartesian set of coordinates, the origin is right here, that intersection between the x, y, and z, or the x and y axes. For the angular reference system, the origin is a horizontal line drawn to the right of an axis of rotation or center of the circle. So that's the origin. So we use that as a reference. That means that any position or movement that's counterclockwise to the origin is given a positive designation, either in degrees or radians, and then any movement in the opposite direction is given a negative number. Simple, simple rules. Counterclockwise is positive, clockwise is negative. So when we take the difference between the two, we're going to have to keep those signs in mind. So a reminder that the axis of rotation is the middle of a circle. It's an imaginary line around which axis, in which movement occurs. So this movement, for example, in the sagittal plane, this is flexion of the shoulder. That's going to be rotating around that x-axis. And movement back to the anatomical position, remember, is going to be extension. So all volitional human movement occurs through rotation around body segments like pronation and supination of the forearm, or it goes through a joint like the elbow joint when we're producing elbow flexion and extension. When muscles pull, they usually pull on a bone at some distance away from the middle of the joint, which is the axis of rotation. So this distance is sometimes called a force arm or a lever arm. And our ability to produce torque for a given force, let's say the quadriceps are producing force upward and maybe at about a 20-degree angle. Some of that force goes towards producing torque or rotation. The rest of it actually goes towards stabilizing the knee joint. In fact, when your quadriceps, your hamstrings, and your gastrocnemius, because they cross the knee too, the gastrocnemius muscle is contracting, it's actually pressing the femur and the tibia together. As they press together, they become more stable. So here we see someone pitching fast pitch softball, and there's the origin going through the shoulder. Adjusting a little bit as I'm moving this around. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about, instead of having a number line, instead of basically following 1, 2, or 3 dimensions, we're going to follow a circle, a curved path. So again, any movement or position counterclockwise is going to give you a positive designation, positive number. So a quarter of a circle is 90 degrees, you know, the 360 degrees in a circle. That's equal to, these are units in radians, pi over 2. Pi over 2, pi is 3.14. We're going to round off to 2 significant digits. Half a circle of rotation counterclockwise is 180 degrees. All the major joints are, except for the ankle, are roughly at 180 degrees when we're in the anatomical position. That's equal to pi radians. 3/4 of a circle in counterclockwise rotation is plus 270 degrees. That's 3 pi over 2, or 1.5 pi, if you will. And then 2 full pi's would be 360 degrees of rotation in the counterclockwise direction. If we go clockwise, we got 300 degrees, or when we go clockwise, minus 60. So this, let's say this is a golf club, or this is an elbow, or maybe like a forearm or an upper arm. If we rotate counterclockwise, that arm is in a position of 300 degrees. If we rotate clockwise, same position, it's minus 60. So these are equivalent positions. Keep those in mind when we're doing joint analysis. You'll need to keep in mind whether or not the origin goes through the middle of the joint as we're trying to measure. So remember, one of the key things is thinking about the anatomical analysis of movement. When we're in the anatomical position, any movement away from the anatomical position is going to close the joint, meaning making the joint smaller. We want to measure the inside of the joint. In other words, where the joint moves away from that anatomical position. So as the forearm comes up, we want to measure this angle, not this one on the outside. Same thing is true for your knee. You want to measure the angle on the inside of the knee rather than the outside of the knee. So if you calculate a joint angle of 260 degrees, 310 degrees, or like 15 degrees, chances are that person's been injured and you need to take them to the emergency room or hospital, or you need to look at your angular reference system again and rethink how you're going to calculate that. So we could be looking at a position of an arm or a golf club. Here's a guy named Scott Demery. We're going to talk about him a bit because he was a really interesting guy. He was an ultra marathon runner. These people run for 24 to 48 hours. Yes, yes, it's actually true. They run to exhaustion and just keep going. He was also a scratch golfer. Doesn't mean he hits it near fire ant mounds and then gets insects all over him. What that means is that he shoots on average even par. Pretty good, not pro level, but really, really good. So he could hit it with this driver about 280, 290 yards, and that wasn't a very good driver. I think I picked that up at Target back in the day. I've got a better driver now, but I'm afraid I don't play a lot of golf. But this thing, in the hands of someone who's able, could hit the ball a long, long way. Okay, so if we were going to, let's say, analyze the position of that golf club, here's the origin. Let me rotate counterclockwise. Half a circle, remember, is 180 degrees. If we go another, it looks to me, I'm going to say this is about 25 degrees. So 180 plus 25, it's about 205 degrees, a 205 degree angle. If we look at the movement of that club over time, we could take the difference, and then by knowing the film speed, how many pictures we take per second, we could calculate like angular velocity, or we could even calculate the curvilinear velocity of the club head. So I was checking out a long driving contest yesterday, and some of those folks can generate club head speeds of 130, 135 miles an hour, and ball speeds exceeding 200 miles an hour. Most PGA and LPGA professionals, if they can hit the ball with a ball speed of 185 miles an hour, they're pretty happy. That's pretty good. So one of the keys, though, is they have to keep it in bounds. So in the contest last night, there was wind blowing, and most of them were getting like 1 out of 8, 0 out of 8, maybe 2 out of 8 in bounds. So they were having a rough time. A relative angular position is basically the difference between two adjacent segments or lines. In fact, that's the way we could describe or define an angle. It's basically the amount of rotation needed to make two intersecting lines perpendicular with each other. So if these are two intersecting lines, that's probably an angle of about 30 degrees. That's the amount of rotation needed to make them parallel. That's about 90 degrees. That's about 135, something like that. One of the main instances where we're going to take the difference between two adjacent segments is when we calculate a joint angle. So that means we're going to take the difference between the angular position of the upper arm and the lower arm. If we're looking at the movement of the knee joint, we're going to take the difference between the upper leg and the lower leg. In this example, we have, let's start on the right because we have this kind of nicely set up and defined. So here's my elbow joint. Here's the origin. here's the joint I want to calculate. So remember, as that joint angle closes, we want to measure that joint angle on the inside. So we're going to take the difference between the position of the upper arm and the lower arm. When the origin doesn't go through the middle of the joint that we're trying to measure, well, I should say middle of the joint angle to describe that better. Middle of the joint angle, then we're going to rotate counterclockwise to get the angular position for the lower arm or forearm and then the upper arm. So let's say the lower arm is at a position of about 50 degrees and the upper arm is at 90 degrees. We'll take 90 minus 50, and that's going to give us a joint angle of 40 degrees. Let's move to this picture. So the origin, if I drew a line, would be straight like that. So this looks a little bit above that. So let's make that 10 degrees. And the origin still is not going through the middle of the joint angle we're trying to measure. So we've got plus 10 degrees. And then let's say it's 90 degrees again. So 90 minus 10 is 80 degrees. So this is an 80-degree joint angle. Believe it or not, that's kind of optimal in terms of producing torque from the elbow flexors, the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and brachioradialis. Okay, here's where we have to throw a little trick in. It's not a really hard one, but let's say that we're going to calculate. I'm going to move the origin, because I can. There we go. So let's say the origin goes through the middle of the joint angle I'm trying to measure. What do we do then? Well, we rotate now, instead of counterclockwise, clockwise to get the position of the lower arm. I'm going to say that's 40 degrees. But remember, we've moved clockwise. So this has to be a negative number, minus or negative 40 degrees. And then I've got 90 again. So 90 minus negative 40, that's like adding a positive number. 90 minus negative 40 is 90 plus 40, or 130 degrees. So this is a 130-degree angle. Good. There we go. So I don't really grade for artwork. In fact, I don't expect your artwork to be really good. In fact, the best thing to do is to print out pictures or maybe use an image of someone playing a sport, or maybe you're looking and analyzing a certain activity. Take a number of pictures and superimpose basically stick figures over them, because stick figure analysis has been around in biomechanics well for as long as there have been video cameras, and especially computers. And now that we have digital video, which we can interface easily into computers, this is the way to go. So if we're looking at the elbow joint, we have someone running, and we're looking at the elbow movement as they are hauling rear here. Let's look at that angle. So I've blown this up. Here's our origin. Notice that the elbow joint angle, the origin doesn't go through that, so I'm going to rotate counterclockwise to get the position of the upper arm and the lower arm. So when you're doing these calculations, make sure you show all of your work. Use subscripts when you can. It really helps to keep things straight. So here I'm going to add a little subscript. The elbow, if I can, let's see. Oh, I'm going to have to. Oh, that was a mistake. Let me go back. I'll have to fix this later. But let's say this is the elbow joint. We're going to take the difference between the position of the lower arm, that's 225 degrees, minus the position of the upper arm. So that's 120 degrees, and that gives us 105. After you calculate a joint angle, look at the picture and see if it looks reasonable. In this case, it definitely does. That means we've probably done it right. If you'd gotten a joint angle of about 295 degrees, you may want to reevaluate that. Probably would be 285, 275. So keep in mind, when you're calculating a joint angle like the knee joint, you want to measure it on the inside. So for the origin here, we could rotate counterclockwise to get the upper leg and then get the lower leg. And when we draw stick figures, we basically go from one joint to the next. That makes sense. You got the hip joint to the knee joint to the ankle. I've used bony landmarks to be able to find those. So the greater trochanter, the epicondyles of the femur, and then the lateral malleolus down by the ankle. That's the distal end of the fibula. They help to be able to mark your joints. These bony landmarks are great to be able to do that. And so when we do our analysis, it really, really helps. So if we wanted to calculate this joint angle, we would rotate around, and that looks like 90 plus, I'm going to make it 20, 110 degrees. And this is about, instead of 270, 275. So 275 minus 110, higher math, that's 165 degrees. So that looks pretty reasonable. When you're doing those calculations, if you measure the joint by accident on the outside, so maybe you get something like 195 degrees instead of 165 degrees. You could take 360 degrees and subtract that outside angle and then get the angle on the inside of the joint. So it's not too bad. So this is Rebecca. Oh, this is one of the first people we filmed way back in the day. This is 21 years ago. I think it's 21 years ago. Wow, long time ago. So in fact, we weren't using either duct tape or reflective markers. I found with exercise, reflective markers tended to fall off and they're incredibly expensive. It was really frustrating. So we started to use actually duct tape, believe it or not, and other types of tape. So here we see the ankle, the knee, and the hip joint. And once we have the origin, we could take the knee joint as the difference between the upper leg and lower leg, 205 degrees of rotation. That makes sense, about 25 degrees past half a circle, minus 120, and that gives us an 85-degree angle. That looks just about right. Excellent. We can even do this with a golf swing. Notice the golf club starting to bend. This is at the beginning of the downswing, so this is pretty cool. So the left arm is at 18 degrees above the origin. The shaft of the golf club is about 81 degrees. So this is a quote unquote, we'll call it a wrist angle. It's not really anatomically accurate, but it just tells us how the hands basically with the club are that angle between that and that straight left arm. So we have that 18-degree angle. There we go. An 81-degree angle. We're going to take the difference between the two, and that's going to give us a quote-unquote wrist angle of 63 degrees. With the golf swing, we've got torso rotation, then shoulder rotation, and then finally what goes on the wrist technically is pronation and supination of the forearm combined with medial and lateral rotation of the dominant and non-dominant shoulders. So it's really not movement around the wrist, either in flexion or extension, or in radial or ulnar deviation. It's basically rotation around the wrist by producing pronation, supination, a lateral rotation of the non-dominant arm, and then medial rotation of the dominant arm. The dominant arm, in the movement that's involved in the swing, it's got a lot more muscle mass, a lot more power. So the left arm's there for guidance. The right arm is there for right-handers, for power. If you're left-handed, the opposite, then that left arm is there for the power. Phil Mickelson, by the way, is actually right-handed. The reason he swings the golf club left-handed is when he started to learn golf, he would do a mirror image of his dad. So his dad would be right across from him, showing him how to do the swing. So he would do the swing left-handed. So that's why he actually swings left-handed, but he signs autographs right-handed, if you've ever noticed that. So something interesting. My daughter, for whatever reason, when she started playing softball, we kept throwing the ball to her, and she's right-handed, so we put her on the right side, but she'd always turn around and go to the left side. And so eventually we figured out, well, she just hit the ball better on the left side. So she became a left-handed hitter. That's an advantage because you're closer to first base. So if you hit a ground ball, you have a better chance at making a single. So let's see, just some basics here. Again, if the origin runs through the middle of the joint that you're trying to measure, this is the elbow joint, then you have to rotate clockwise. Remember, give it a negative number to get, in this case, since we have the elbow, we've got the upper arm and the forearm. The upper arm's 10 degrees below the origin. The forearm is 105 degrees counterclockwise from the origin, so that's 105 minus 10, and that's equal to 115 degrees. Some basic terms I'm just going to spend a moment or two on. I know you guys know this. Perimeter is the outside surface of any object. Circumference is actually an arc length that covers an entire circle. It's the curvilinear distance around the circle, and it, of course, is going to be the product of the radius and then the arc, which we're going to define in radians. The radius of a circle is the distance between the middle, or the axis of rotation, and the perimeter. And the radius, of course, is the same regardless of which direction you take the radius. Diameter is 2 times the length of the radius, but it bisects the circle. You could go left or right or up or down. The ratio of the length of the circumference divided by the diameter is equal to pi. Pi is equal to 3.14159. Goes out basically to infinity. The Guinness World Book of Records has been held by a few people. I think it's out to 100,000 plus digits. Someone's actually memorized pi and I think it would take now years to actually recite it. So it's kind of crazy. There was one guy who had the Guinness World Book of Records for a while. He lived in India, but he couldn't do much else besides knowing pi. We'll call pi 3.14 and try to use it. So utility, again, is going to be the key for us. An arc is basically an angle, difference in 2 angular positions. We could be looking at position of an arm or a body segment over time, or measuring a joint angle. So it's a rotary difference between 2 angular positions. We'll use theta as a general term to describe it. It can be measured either in degrees or radians. Technically, radians are the standard units. Standard units can be very important for us. Meters are standard units for linear distance and curvilinear distance, for example. But radians are the standard units for angular movement or an arc. This L here, this is something we call an arc length. An arc length is a curvilinear distance covered on the outside of the circle. So when someone swings a golf club, the golf club basically covers an arc length around the wrist, and then we can look at that wrist or hand movement around the shoulder, and then finally trunk movement. And if you add those up and get your vectors right, you can predict pretty accurately what the club head speed would be. So pretty interesting. Pi again is 3.14. The arc length is the product of the arc and the radius. So the longer the radius, makes sense, the greater the arc length. So the longer the club, the greater the arc length. So in the long driving contest for men and for women, they had these really super long drivers. The longer the arc length, the greater the club head speed, because they're going to be covering a greater distance for a given period of time. So it's an advantage for pitchers, softball pitchers, fast pitch softball pitchers, and major league pitchers to have long arms and long legs. That actually helps a great deal. Gives you a longer arc length, and that means faster speed at the hand or the club head or the tennis racket. So the arc times the radius, that gives us the arc length. So there's the arc length, again, a curvilinear distance on the outside of an arc. Something interesting about the arc length that gets us to why the standard units for an arc are in radians. So this is a particular angle, a really interesting angle. It's 57.3 degrees. It's like a magic angle. And at this angle, the radius of the circle, that length is equal to the length of the arc length. They are exactly the same. Ooh, spooky. So if the angle gets smaller, the radius stays the same and the arc length decreases. If the arc or the angle increases, let's say it's an entire circle, that would actually give us the entire circle 306 degrees. So why is 57.3 degrees interesting? Again, with the radius and the arc length are the same, this is actually 1 radian. 1 radian. So if we said arc length is equal to the radius times the arc in radians, and that arc in radians is 1, then the arc length and the radius are exactly the same. So this is, again, like a magic angle. And if we cover a full circle, there happen to be 2 pi radians. That's 2 times 3.14 or 6.28. So a circumference is basically an arc length for an entire circle. Pretty cool. If you forget they're 57.3 degrees in 1 radian, then just remember they're 360 degrees in a full circle. So that's equal to 2 pi radians. And then you can go from there. We're going to stop right here. I'm going to have, I guess, another short lecture, which I probably will extend this particular video to talk about kinematics and kinetics. Okay, so back in a few minutes. Here we go.